Hey guys, on this episode, we talked to Danielle Herrick. She has a really cool background, really interesting background. She's an absolute problem solver, and she has so many great rules of thumb that we get into in terms of building a program, in terms of rolling things out that are actually effective to drive that culture of integrity that really separates us from our competitors. So enjoy.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hey bestie, hope you're having an amazing day. You have such an amazing smile, and this world is a better place because you're in it. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus reading on every single episode. So join us as we change the world by fixing our workplaces. I am here with Danielle Herrick. She's a seasoned ethics and compliance professional currently working in the energy space. How's it going, Danielle?
Great. Glad to be here. Hi, everyone.
Glad to have you on. So I want to just kind of dive in. I always love to hear people's story of how they got into the ethics and compliance game. So, when you were a little girl, did you want to be a compliance officer?
I don't know that anyone starts out wanting to be a compliance officer when they're young. I think maybe it's more common nowadays. There seems to be more formal education in the space. But
Yeah.
I actually have an interesting story. I think I kind of fell into it, which is probably not that uncommon. So I actually worked with adults with disabilities when I was in college and shortly thereafter, and I really thought that was my career path. I was going to continue working kind of in social services, but working with adults with disabilities. I really enjoyed that type of work. I moved to North Carolina and continued that effort. And it's interesting how regulated working with adults with disabilities is, especially from a funding perspective. There are all sorts of requirements, especially for the staff that works with the different agencies. They have to have certain training requirements in order for funding to be obtained, certain years of experience, et cetera. And after I had worked actually managing a group home with adults with disabilities for a couple of years, I moved into a more of a training and compliance role with the organization, helping to make sure that all of our staff met the required qualifications. And it kind of blossomed from there. So very early in my career, it was really more focused on credentials in that space and training compliance. And then I shifted a little bit more to other areas of human resources compliance, leaves of absence, FMLA compliance, ERISA compliance, before I really moved into what I tend to describe as a more traditional corporate compliance and ethics role that I've probably been in for the past 15, 18 years or so.
How did you get involved with working with adults with disabilities?
So it actually happened when I was in college. I took a part-time job and it
Just
was
randomly?
Randomly. My major before that was more in finance and business. And I took a random job working with really one woman when it started who had developmental disabilities. And my job was basically to help integrate her into society. So I spent a lot of time taking her to eat and shopping and to experience different things. We went to concerts together. I would take her on my college campus and show her around. And we just spent a tremendous amount of time together and formed a really close bond. And that really had me change my career more into sociology and really thought that was going to be where I stayed.
What was it about? I mean, you were looking for a part-time job, I guess. You saw this ad. What was it about the ad that resonated with you? Because probably thousands of people looked right past that ad,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really hadn't had a lot of experience even being around adults with disabilities prior to that time. But the ad itself, it was limited hours, which was important. I had a pretty heavy course load in college. So it wasn't a job that was going to require 20, 40 hours a week. It had some flexibility built into it. And when I went and kind of met the folks at the agency, everyone was so incredibly nice. And it's amazing how far that goes when it comes to looking for an opportunity. I'm not sure I would have gone down that path or even really pursued it, but everyone was so incredibly nice and just generous with their time and really, really cared about what they were doing. It's very interesting, especially when I look back at my career, the different companies I've worked at. But when people feel close to the mission, it creates a different kind of culture and work environment.
Yeah, and it's so infectious,
It really is.
So when was it in that process that you said, man, I should really kind of pivot from business and finance into something, like sociology?
Pretty quick. It happened right away.
Really?
With probably months. Yeah, I was like, I could do this. And I very much approached it from the perspective of wanting to make sure that people had rights, that they were allowed to live their lives like anybody else. And the first person that I started working with, she was older. She lived at home with her parents, and her parents were getting older, and they were terrified about what was
Oh
going to
yeah.
happen in the past. And they really didn't want her in a group home setting. They really wanted her equipped to live on her own and to make sure that she had as many of the life skills that she could that would support her in that process. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it's amazing to help someone transition into that type of independent living.
Yeah, it's probably it's hard for me to imagine what that, like, how big of a chasm that is.
It's huge, and it's not right for everyone. And as I, worked in that field for a little bit longer, different people have different needs and different levels of abilities, but there's still this same kind of common thread about getting folks out there, giving them the same experiences that everyone else has, even when it's difficult.
So aside from the like really nice people that were totally engaged with the mission, what was it about this field that resonated with you at a deeper level than what you were learning in your finance classes?
I think you feel like you're changing someone's life. And I don't know that I felt that way when
Yeah.
it came to accounting courses and business writing and those types of things. And working in that field, at least at that time, this really gave you an opportunity to directly impact someone or more than one person and see that impact. And who doesn't want to change someone's life for the better?
Have you always been that way?
A little bit, yeah. I'm a bit of a problem solver in general, which has worked well with my career, but I'm a bit of a problem solver. I always want to make things better. And I also really want to, look at the bigger, broader picture and the greater cause of things.
You're kind of a bringing order to chaos type of person, huh?
I try.
So, all
Sure.
right. So you're starting to get exposed to some of this compliance stuff.
Hmm.
You're in school, you change your major. Tell me like what happened from there.
Yeah, so I changed my major, graduated, continued to work in that field for a number of years, and continue to enjoy it, but also enjoy kind of that problem solving piece of making sure that you have adequate staffing. It's not necessarily a field similar to compliance that a lot of people think they're going to go into,
Hmm.
and making sure that people have, the right skills and qualities and certifications to do it, and really wanting to make sure that you're bringing the right people into people's lives because again, it has a direct impact. But to continue in that process, and it's actually a very interesting field. When I lived in North Carolina, quite a few of the folks who worked for the organization had children or relatives, and they could actually receive government funding in order to care for their own relative, but they still had to meet all of the requirements and the qualifications.
Oh, wow.
So very interesting. But you want to make sure that they have all the required training and then some, and can really do everything that needs to be done as well, even if they're related to the individual.
Yeah. So if you're related, you don't get like a break. If you're going to get government funds, you need to be dialed in and meet all those criteria that they've established.
Yeah, you do. And there can be some conflicts of interest involved in that as well.
Yeah, sure.
Whether you're looking out for the best interest of the individual, or yourself when you're receiving those funds.
So within this field, it's obviously a melting pot. It's not a monolith. There's probably some common thread in terms of like why people are attracted to the field, but you still have all these different personalities.
Yeah.
What is it about this sort of compliance stuff or essentially the enablement of, these people who are providing this service or providing this, this value to these, adults with disabilities? What is it about that attracted you to it and that you really thrived in it to the point where now you've made this part of it, you've kind of run down that track, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think I seem to look at things through a slightly different lens sometimes, and it makes me that much more interested in it. And when I first started, a lot of the folks that I encountered, as nice as they were, who worked in this field, they often took the easy way out. It was often easier to make meals in the group home. It was often easier to do the grocery shopping while the individuals were off in different work programs for the day, as opposed to taking them with you to the grocery store or
Right.
taking them out to a meal. And, I immediately saw that there was kind of a gap there and the need for exposure, that even though it's easier to do certain things by yourself than it is to take 6 adults with you, that's really, not giving them all of the experiences that they need. And it's not going to help them grow their life
Right.
skills or potentially be able to move on and become more independent over time. And I think that, that seeing that, and again, wanting to solve that problem, but also wanting to, kind of change the way organizations think about it, and even the people we hire and what they do, and making sure that they know when they get into this, that's an expectation.
Mm-hmm.
That the easy way out is not always the best way. And I think that's probably pretty true.
It's probably
And,
true everywhere. Yeah.
it really is. And even when I transitioned into a more compliance or office administrative type role, I still worked very closely with the individuals that the organization supported, but still really cared a lot about kind of how we were structuring the company going forward, and really liked getting into kind of the requirements of things and the policies that we needed in place and how we could do things and do it the right way. And I think that's really where it comes in, from an ethics and integrity perspective. It's not just simply doing the job and checking the box, but are we making good decisions?
Do you feel like your drive to help folks do things the right way was really kind of based in your belief in the like value that doing things right in this realm, like doing things right in this realm really matter because of what we're trying to do? Like, was that the basis for it, or was it really more holistic to say we should just be doing things right in general?
I think it was more holistic than that. Especially since I've transitioned to other industries and kind of maintained that same
Yeah.
philosophy of things. So I think it really is more holistic, and it's not always black and white, right? When you're talking about what is the right thing, it's not always going to be extremely clear. And I think those nuances make it even that much more interesting
Mm-hmm.
when you're trying to help people kind of make good decisions and to think about things from different points of view and different perspectives and analyze the risk that's associated with it. If it was always black and white, I don't know that it would be so interesting.
Right.
But I think that it's definitely a more holistic approach.
Okay, so you're in this field and then you move to another field. So talk to me about that. What was it about? Like, how did you know you were at the end of the runway, or what was it about the next opportunity that was engaging enough for you to kind of take that plunge?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that once I made that slight transition into a more kind of compliance role, it took off from there.
Got it.
And it really became an area that I wanted to focus on. I'm really big on learning everything I can about a particular area. I wanted to obtain certifications. I wanted to see what other people were doing. I read all the books. I read all the online papers that I could get. But I really kind of jumped in with both feet, and it took off from there. And I do, even though I tend to refer to some things as corporate compliance, more traditional compliance, I have a really broad view of what compliance is. And my roles have varied over the years. Because there's been so many years. But it's varied, where it's had different kind of concentrations in different areas, but I've always been more of a generalist. So I've always looked at compliance in a number of different areas. So even when it was more on employee relations and HR and even ERISA and benefit plans and leave of absence compliance, and then transitioned into more third-party risk management, bribery and corruption, conflicts of interest, sanctions, all the good stuff. I've always kind of kept my foot in kind of that employee relations piece because there's such a heavy overlap with other areas of compliance and wanting to make sure that employees are well trained and that they do make good decisions. But I absolutely jumped in with both feet, and I'm a big believer that I'm also a compliance realist, but I'm a big believer that if you can create the right culture at an organization, if you can really work with people on making good decisions, asking questions, speaking up when they need to, that it's less about the law and the regulations and the acronyms that go along with it. It's less about the minute details in a policy. Because generally speaking, they're going to try and make good decisions. They're going to try to do the right thing. And they're going to ask questions when they don't know. And that goes a really, really long way. But I think it ties in nicely to most human resources organizations and kind of some of the areas that they focus on as well.
So, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but you said, you have a kind of a different view of compliance. Let's dive into that and unpack that, because if it's going in the direction I think I might have a similar view as you.
So I think it's interesting. I go to all sorts of conferences. I talk to a lot of peers in my network, and I sometimes feel like those in the compliance and ethics space, have more of a rainbows and unicorns perspective. They talk about all these great things they're doing, all of these interesting, innovative trainings, all of these cool things they put into their policies, and these, the technology they've implemented for all of these certifications and all of these fancy, fancy things. And I'm just much more of a compliance realist. So I know that my employees don't read my code of conduct. I know they're not reading my policies.
Right.
I'm thankful and happy if they have a question and they search for it and they find the answer. And I feel like that's a really big win. But
Right.
I'm not going to go on and talk about how great my code of conduct is and how much my employees are learning from it and enjoying it and the impact it's having when they're not reading it.
Right.
I know they're not reading it. I know most people in my direct function aren't reading it cover to cover, right? I mean, they'll look at different sections for specific areas of interest.
Yeah, I haven't even read mine at my company. I'm just kidding.
Right.
But why do you think people spend so much time talking about that thing? You know what I'm saying? I mean, is it just a new shiny object? Is it just something that they love the idea of it really being this force of changing people's lives? Do you know what I'm saying? But because I agree with you, nobody reads it, and well, I'll make this point in a second. So I mean, why is that? Why is it why does it get so much freaking airtime? Is my question.
I mean, I think some people in compliance and ethics make things the most important things in their world, and they make it perhaps bigger than it actually is in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that, there is some expectation that you have to have certain things in place from a defense perspective. So if something goes wrong,
Sure.
a regulator comes in and you say, I don't have a code of conduct because no one's going to read it anyway, it's probably not going to get you very far.
True.
So I think some of the approach is, well, I have to have all these things in because it's expected. And then some companies do spend a tremendous amount of time and energy and money making it great. But I don't know that even at those organizations, I highly, highly doubt that the general employee is reading that cover to cover. Does it look better from a defense perspective? Maybe.
Maybe though.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely not absolutely.
I don't think it's absolutely. And I worked at an organization that really, really believes in their code of conduct. When they went about redoing their code of conduct, they had a documentary film crew film the entire process. So they filmed.
That sounds like a riveting documentary. Yeah.
Hey, it went to Sundance.
Oh, well, I'm eating my words as we speak. Pardon me.
I don't know that riveting is still the right word. So they had a documentary film crew film kind of the experience of how they came up with a name for the code of conduct, the involvement of the board, how they vetted it around the world in focus groups with all of these different people to try and get the language exactly right. How when they finalized it, they published it and printed it. And they wanted it to be printed by the same printer and distributed all over the world in local language so that it had the same look and feel. They wanted everyone to have a hard copy. And they wanted hard copies in every office entranceway, in every break room.
Bathroom,
Yeah, if you lost your copy, there was a formal process to request a new copy. I mean, they really did it, right? I mean, if you're rolling out a new code of conduct, I mean, it came out with a film that everyone was required to watch. They had a trickle-down release. I'm pretty sure that in New York City, they reserved a theater to launch it to employees at the headquarters. Every level of management was involved in launching it to their team. And I know for a fact that the vast majority of those employees didn't read that code cover to cover.
Right.
So did they certify that they did? Yes.
But let's I want to talk about that certification thing in a second, but do you think though that there were some positive externalities to that whole thing? And I mean, at some level, it's at least conveying to the employee base that the company actually gives, a huge care about this, and they're really putting actual effort behind this code, and this code is, in theory, this sort of articulation of who we are and how we want to behave. Talk to me about that, because I agree with you. I don't think anyone is reading the codes, but there might be some positive benefit for them being geez, they went freaking all out on this code of conduct. That sounds crazy. Wow, they must really actually care about this.
Yeah, and that was the intent. The intent was we're comfortable spending all this money because that's how important it is to us. And that's the message we want to send.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll say that I think the focus groups are extremely beneficial because you're talking to people, right? So you're in a group.
And they're a part of it. And even if you're not in one of those groups, that it's informed by your peers and it's not just done in some ivory tower or something.
Exactly. And you're getting direct feedback on not just sections, but actual areas of compliance and ethics. Like, does this resonate with you? Is this
Mm-hmm.
culturally appropriate? So I do think there's a benefit to the process itself.
Oh
That
my
they would,
gosh, you're kind of getting me excited about this documentary now.
it's not bad. I will say that, this is an organization and it's been out there. I'm sure folks are probably familiar, but they also used that same documentary film crew to develop their own training series.
Oh,
And probably one of the best things about their training series is that they use their own employees
that's cool.
from around, and they had to audition.
Really?
Ran it just like a film audition.
Oh my gosh.
And I actually helped create one of the courses with them. And I would sit in a room and we would have the most senior executives come in and audition. And the producers would be like, pretend you're a tree. And I was like, I don't know what we're doing. But they ran it, they created these quote unquote films. I think that I did the 9th one when I was there, and I think there's maybe even more than that now. But the employees loved them because they saw people they knew acting as villains and in weird roles.
So
And
fun, yeah.
yeah. So even if the topic wasn't necessarily particularly riveting, the way it was done was quite cool. And people liked that. They liked seeing people they know,
So
which was interesting.
you're kind of describing this type of company that's kind of this unicorn company, because I have hundreds of conversations with compliance people all the time, and everyone is talking about the same thing. It's all about the tone at the top. Man, if you don't have that tone at the top, you are swimming upstream. It sounds like you were in an organization where that tone at the top was like dialed in, full endorsement to all these things to reinforce the behaviors that are going to drive, the manifestation of our company in the marketplace. But I'm also kind of reading between the lines that it wasn't like this silver bullet.
Exactly. And it came about after wrongdoing, which I think is often the case.
This full court press was like a response to some wrongdoing.
Response to wrongdoing. And it did change and shape the culture of the company.
The wrongdoing did? Or the response, or
wrongdoing
both?
did and the response, both did. But so it came after an event, right? So there was an event, and then this was the response. And the response lasted, though. It wasn't something that kind of kicked
Right.
off. I mean, I worked there almost 12 years, and that was a number of years ago. And that same approach is taken today.
Wow. Okay.
Um, and so it was a long-lasting impact on the organization. But when you actually talk to the employees, and maybe even more so now that it's a little bit after it had originally started, but when you talk to them today, are you actually reading the code? Have you actually read it? I don't think they actually are. But I think that there's other things that have been learned about what actually does work, what actually does resonate with people.
Right. I
It's
guess
not
there's
necessarily publishing things.
Yeah, it's not necessarily publishing things, but it's almost like if you don't have that full court press where there's like a willingness to spend a couple of bucks and experiment, then the odds of you making one bet that's going to totally work is a lot lower,
I think it's a lot lower. And I think too that, even though I've described this really kind of top down, there was a lot of engagement throughout. So they
Sounds like it,
really
yeah.
didn't limit it to top. There's a lot of middle management engagement. There is a lot of, requirements put on people. And there was a fair amount of competition for teams to make sure that their groups had completed 100% of the annual training and that they had all completed their certification that it had to be. But there was a fair amount of like who could get to 100% first.
So that's smart, right? That's getting people
Yeah.
engaged, and it's figuring out some way to kind of gamify it and
Yeah.
lean into the competitive spirit that's in all human beings and stuff like that. But I want to kind of unpack a little bit more, because maybe I'm wrong, but like it sounds like no company is perfect, but it sounds like there was a genuine, earnest effort to like rectify whatever circumstances were in place that allowed that wrongdoing to happen. And it sounds like you had this sort of tone at the top endorsement that allowed you, whatever your department, to explore those things and try different things. What was surprising about that? Or like, what would a listener who is like, oh my gosh, I just wish I had that kind of a situation. Like, I don't know, there's, I don't know, every promised land has weeds in it. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no sort of like perfect place, right? So like,
Right.
what would you tell somebody who is who feels like they don't have that kind of tone at the top, and they feel like they're spinning their wheels, and they wish they could have more impact, and they think, man, that silver bullet is just, if I could wave a magic wand and get that same kind of endorsement, then all my problems would be gone. I mean, that's kind of how people think about this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always two sides, right? And as positive and wonderful an experience this was from a compliance and ethics perspective to even be involved in, you had a fair amount of employees who were like, how much did that cost? My percentage increase was only X. We had layoffs.
Right.
Would we have fewer layoffs if you didn't spend all this money on this? And those were fair questions that people were asking. And there was a fair amount of that. So there was definitely a negative side to it, and kind of how to use an organization
balance
handle
that.
And even though the response was very much, we think this is so important, which is why we're willing to spend this kind of money on it, that doesn't necessarily ease everyone's view on how that money was being spent.
That's a great point. I had never even really thought about that. But yeah, if on the one hand you're spending all this money to put a Hollywood, you're trying to get into Sundance and you're doing Hollywood style, trainings, and this code of conduct is printed, it's like a bunch of coffee table books sent around. And then on the other hand, you have all these layoffs. Guys are like, this seems like maybe a bad waste of money, and maybe we're spending money in the wrong place or something. So yeah, that's an interesting kind of mixed message that people could be left with, maybe a different taste in their mouth than what was intended.
And I'm a big believer that even without the big spend, even without a strong tone at the top, there's still a lot that compliance and ethics professionals can do.
I agree.
Still a lot of impact.
And I would say it also, this is just my guess, but I would also say it the other way. Like, even if you have that tone at the top, it's not like it's like you're just skipping up a mountain. Like, there's a bunch of issues no matter what. There's always going to be brambles and thistles. You know what I'm saying? There's always going to be weeds in the garden. There's always going to be trouble. So,
yeah.
So
exactly.
Anyways, so you were there for a while. What did you move on to next?
So I've stayed in compliance pretty consistently, and moved around in some different industries. What was really interesting is, so I'd worked at this long kind of storied institution of a company, and had that great experience. And I went to work at a startup. I was the 8th employee.
Wow.
Which was intended to be a relatively short-lived part of my career path, because a lot of people who are more senior don't necessarily go to a startup. And it was probably the best decision that I ever made.
Wow.
I would say that I had gotten relatively senior in my prior role. I'd worked with large teams. I had a good budget, all of those things that you don't have at a startup. And it really forced me to kind of step back and create a program where none existed. I mean, nothing existed. And think about, well, how would I do this?
Yeah.
It really is up to me. I don't have a team. I'm actually going to write all the policies.
Right.
Like everything. What does that look like if you have kind of a blank slate? And on top of that, if anyone's ever worked at a startup, that you're also the one that sometimes runs to the post office to pick up the mail. And you're the one who sees something pink come through that you've got to deal with a tax notice in Texas, things that you've never done before. And it's all hands on deck. There's not any people who are necessarily experts in everything.
Right.
So you're building a program from the ground up, with very much a blank slate, not a lot of funding, and also trying to build a company.
So you're in this big company, you're relatively senior, big teams, big budget, doing all these like massive big things. You see this other opportunity as a startup to be the 8th employee. What were you looking for in that role that you were hoping to get that caused you to like make that jump? And then what was surprising when you got into it? Because I'm sure there's probably surprises on both sides, right? Like, I thought I was going to get this and I was going to love it and I hated it, or I wasn't even thinking about this thing that, man, this ended up shaping so much of my mentality or my, career or whatever.
Yeah, I was looking to go somewhere that was innovative. There were pockets of that at other organizations
Sure.
I'd worked in, but not in its entirety. And I thought that would be something that would be really interesting from a career perspective, to just work where people are building something, but in a really more innovative, way, and have a fresh look at things. So that was really kind of the drive to go there. And from a compliance perspective, to also have the ability to make all of the decisions and all of the recommendations, and really help kind of start with a foundation, a really solid foundation, hopefully, for a company, I think is really enticing.
Mm-hmm.
that opportunity doesn't come along. And it actually works well with kind of my personality and that I'm a doer. Sometimes that has a negative connotation when you become more senior in different roles, but regardless, you can still accomplish things and be a doer. But it worked well for me because I was willing to do the work. I didn't need a team of people to do it for me. I wasn't delegating creation of policies or training or this or that. I was the one who was actually contracting with the vendors, developing all the content, doing the voiceovers, whatever it happened to be. And I think that doesn't work for everybody, but was a really good fit for me.
Yeah, it's weird. Like as people get higher in an organization or they get more senior, it's like their arms start to shrink into those alligator arms where they just can't really do anything. They're just sort of pointing at people to do other things. What was surprising to you? You were coming from a relatively more mature program into this startup environment where they had nothing. Were there any situations where like you were really shocked about how a recommendation that seemed very obvious to you was just like absolutely not, or like, you know what I mean? Like kind of totally shut down in that startup environment. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge is that it was in a relatively heavily regulated industry. The leadership team didn't necessarily have experience in that industry. So they had worked at startups, they had built companies before, they were very entrepreneurial, but didn't necessarily have that experience. And it was interesting when I would have to go and have those conversations and say, well, the regulators require this, or under this state law, we have to do it this way. And they were like, that doesn't make any sense. And I was like, I agree. It doesn't make any sense. It is what it is. But those conversations were much more difficult than I think I had anticipated.
Because why?
I'd come from a world where people were like, well, if that's the law, and we have to follow it. Whether or not you had missteps along the way, sure. But the general kind of immediate reaction was always, well, of course we're going to follow the law. And here they wanted to challenge the law.
Right.
And pretty consistently.
They're like, well, that makes no sense. How could we possibly do that?
Yeah. And is there another way to do things? Can we think about things differently?
It's that entrepreneur mind. Yeah.
It is. And it challenges you as a compliance professional to say, well, is there other ways we can do it? To really think about it. But it was definitely a bit more unexpected, but healthy as far as negotiating, with people over how we were going to move forward.
So you're stepping in, you get this blank canvas and now you're going to build your entire, compliance program masterpiece. How did you start to assess which elements you needed to start to put into place first? Was it just going down the list? Was it looking at the business and seeing like what's in place that I can leverage? Like, how did you start to approach that? And what kind of hacks did you develop, or like looking back, what would you have done differently,
Yeah, so I tend to take a more methodical approach, which I don't know if I would do in hindsight. But the first thing I did was build a regulatory obligations matrix. I wanted to make sure we all knew what all the regulations were that we had to follow.
Okay.
I felt like that was a good starting point because that would drive policy. And then I also did a compliance risk assessment. So to kind of say, okay, what are our top risks? What do we actually need to focus more of our energy and our effort on? And then started to build the program based on the results of those two things. Mm-hmm. And it's not uncommon for how I still approach things. But I'd already been pretty seasoned, pretty experienced. I knew what policies we needed. I knew we needed a code of conduct. I knew we needed training. I knew I needed a testing and monitoring program and a risk assessment process. I knew the basics that were needed. And can put pen to paper and create a list of all of those things. Mm-hmm. But I didn't jump in doing it that way. I still wanted to say, what are all the regulations that we have to follow? Where can I leverage technology to help solve some of these problems? Versus adding people. I think that in my experience, it's sometimes easier to add people later than it is to add technology later. So if you have too many people, it's harder to get a system put in place. So there, I very intentionally said, what kind of technical solutions are there?
Oh, smart. Okay. You're saying it's easier for people to step in to like an existing technology than it is to perhaps effectively like replace people with the technology.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen companies that are very people heavy and less technology driven, and I don't find that to be as scalable. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you can get that technology in place and then determine what your team looks like, both from an organizational design perspective and from how many folks you might need, And it may not be what you thought once you've gotten some of those solutions in place. It makes it a little harder if you're a team of one to manage the technology and the program before you've built the team. But I stand by that. I think that getting the right technology in place is really, really important. And working at a startup, they are more open to that. It was a technology driven industry and business, and they were very open to finding those solutions versus people.
So, like, how did you navigate the, like, there was no compliance in place. You're coming in and you're saying, hey, here's a law we have to follow. And they're like, I haven't even been thinking about that law. I'm just running here. How did you balance that? Like, how did you not fall into the trap of, like, being the anti-business or the anti-startup department?
Yeah, I was very careful as far as how much I chose to vocalize different things we needed or what I was working on.
Okay.
Didn't need to know all the nuts and bolts necessarily.
Yeah, right.
It was information I could share as an FYI, but why? If I didn't actually need their input, I kept it to myself and I built it and I put it in place. And
Okay.
that I think helped so that when I did vocalize different things, there was an immediate level of focus and emphasis on it because they knew it was.
Yeah, you weren't
important.
crying wolf. Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't going to bother them with the mundane things that we all knew we needed, because that just wasn't something that they were going to focus on at the same time. But I do think that is a real risk that you face, whether it's a startup or not, is how you kind of interact with the business in that regard. And because I come from it as a problem solver, I'm trying to solve business problems as well. I want to know exactly what you do, how you're going to do it, what is it going to look like so that I can put the right controls in place along the way so that as they're building, I'm building with them. And it's not something where I'm going to come in after the fact and be like, you did that wrong, or you should have done this, or now we need to do this and it's going to change everything. But making sure that I was engaging with the right people, and it's not always the top people, but making sure I was engaging with the right people so that I could identify compliance and ethics related concerns or controls that they needed very early on, was helpful.
Yeah. I don't think, well, let me ask you, do you think everybody in compliance is like a problem solver like that?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
And I've worked with a lot of people who don't approach it that way.
Yeah, I agree. They think it's sort of more black and white and it's binary and like, well, this is it. And it's just like, well, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. So,
yes.
You know what I mean?
Here's a policy. You have to follow the policy. I have to provide training. I'm going to do my training at this time, even if it's the worst time for the business. I'm going to require 100% completion, and this is how we're going to do it.
Right.
And that doesn't work everywhere.
And also, not everybody can achieve what you're talking about in various, environments or circumstances.
Yeah, and it doesn't make sense. All of those companies who offer all of their compliance and ethics training during someone's first 30 days of employment, how effective is that? How much of that is
It's
actually
a joke, yeah.
Or do you do it because everyone's does it that way, and you've always done it that way? And why not offer gifts and entertainment training the first time someone signs up for access to the travel site,
There you go.
or the first time they access iExpense or whatever the expense reimbursement portal is? Why not know what your high risk countries are from a bribery and corruption perspective, and get a travel alert so that you can then send them a notice saying, hey, I see you're traveling to India. They have a high risk of corruption. Here's a couple things to keep in mind.
There's this.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this interesting thing that I think our market is kind of maybe more than anywhere else, like influenced by. And it's like, how much of what we're doing is a function of like something that some company came up with on like, here, buy this, do this way. And there's this crazy price with it. I'm just kind of thinking about training. Like in my mind, training should be at the point of risk, and it should be smart in terms of like not, it shouldn't be a 2-week boot camp of listening to compliance training. That should be sporadic. It should be sprinkled throughout the year. It should be actually digestible, because I'm not trying to just check a box to say, hey, DOJ, I did my training, but rather if I can actually get people to change their behaviors because they understand what matters, why it matters, all that other stuff, I'm going to be in a much better spot and never talking to the DOJ. That's just like my philosophy. But there's so many things in place right now where, like, put it this way, like, we are totally dependent on fossil fuels because everybody's just sold fossil fuel cars.
Right.
Right. And so who knows if we would be able to like develop a new type of engine that wouldn't rely on fossil fuels, that would be cleaner or more efficient or cheaper or whatever. At this point, it's like it's all so entrenched. There's almost like no near-term chance of us like getting off of that platform that's been established. I feel like there's some things like that in our industry. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's these massive trainings that take all these hours and things like that. How do we get out of that? Like, is it just going to take time for that to trickle out? Is it going to take people like you who are problem solvers, who are really looking at this thing with fresh eyes and to say, well, what's my real objective and how can I solve that irrespective of like the status quo, like heuristics or rules of thumb that are in place?
Yeah, I think it's going to take more people who are willing to take a chance and for things not to work. And that's what I learned in the startup, right? Like, it's okay to fail, and that's how you learn the most. But if we don't try different things, we're not necessarily going to know what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, right.
And people have to be willing for it not to work. And I think from a compliance and ethics perspective, we're so ingrained in, regulatory risk and having to follow the law that failure, we see it as not an option. When in reality, I think it's okay to fail in some cases,
Totally,
right? I don't think that's the law necessarily, but when it comes to how we implement our programs and how we do things, it's okay if we don't get it right. But you also need an organization that's open to that. And not all organizations' culture is built around that fail fast mentality.
Right.
It's okay if it doesn't work and you can try it again.
So as you've moved on from that fail fast environment where you were able to stand up a program and paint this sort of masterpiece, how has that influenced other experiences you've had? Has it let you be more flexible, more creative? How has that played out?
So I've tried to keep a lot of what I learned kind of in that startup environment with me, even if the rest of the organization may have a slightly different approach or culture around things. And I think that I've definitely tried to make sure that you cannot overemphasize the importance of being familiar with and involved in the business.
Yeah.
And, compliance and ethics is not a function that should sit in the back room and wait for someone to come to us and ask a question. And I work in the energy sector now. It is not my sweet spot by any means to even try and figure out what we're doing, how we're doing it, the questions I have to ask, the number of demos I have to get. But it's really, really important to me to understand what we do and what difficulties people encounter on a day-to-day basis. And are there areas I can help improve? Even if it's not traditionally thought of as compliance and ethics, it gains knowledge on both parties and just awareness. Mm-hmm. And I've spent a tremendous amount of time just talking to people and trying to figure out what it is they're doing. Where are the risks? How can I help with that? And not just help from a compliance and ethics perspective and that risk, but just in general, can I improve their process? If I have a bunch of manufacturing employees who don't have access to a laptop, and then I launch an annual code of conduct training that they have to take with a laptop.
Right.
How does that work?
Where are they going to do that? Yeah. On Saturday? Right.
How are they going to do that? And how are we going to pay them for that when you don't want to take them off the line, right? For anything at all? Like, what does that look like? And it's interesting because, manufacturing is a big part of my current company. And when I've talked to peers in manufacturing, when I say, well, tell me about your manufacturing program. How did you figure that out? Their programs look exactly the same as their corporate programs. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. And, so even now, I've been there 2.5 years and I'm still trying to figure out how can I create some unique manufacturing compliance and ethics program that really focuses in on what they need to know.
Right.
So if I have a plant in the US, do they need a lot of anti-bribery and corruption training?
Probably not.
Probably not. Do they need a lot of conflict resolution training?
Yeah.
Yes.
Ton.
Is that traditionally my area? Probably not, but that's what they need. How do we deliver training? Is it going back to printing? Should I give them a printed code of conduct in their break room? Probably. That's probably a great environment for that type of approach.
Right.
If I send an email out to all of my employees, they're not.
Who's going to read it? Yeah.
They're not reading that. Is there a way for me to give them a text message? Because that's how they communicate with their supervisors and managers. But it's, kind of taking that thought of, if I'm trying to build something, and in this case, yes, we have a program, but I wouldn't say we do that's specific for manufacturing. If I'm trying to build something like I did at a startup, what do I need to know about how they operate on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it forces you to just bring those fresh eyes to it and really sort of think about it with a clean slate,
And to challenge, executives and other leaders in the organization who have always done it a certain way.
So I know we're right at time here. I did want to just quickly mention this post you put up recently. It was like an orange post on your LinkedIn, and it said something about, why are we having people certify that they've read their code of conduct? We should rather do X. So I want to talk about that briefly if you have time.
Yeah.
But what really resonated with me is it's like no one's reading it, and then you're making them certify. It's like you're forcing them to lie or something.
And you know that going into it.
Exactly. Right.
Right. And if I had $1 for every time someone said, "You've never told us that, we've never seen it," and I'm like, but I sent you an email, or I did this and I did that. They're just not reading it. Right. I mean, they're telling me every day they're not reading it. So what do I want them to do? Do I want them to know where to find it? Do I want them to review it when they need to? Do I want them to certify that they're going to raise concerns? And am I going to put enough language in there that they don't have to go to the code to know what they're certifying to? Right. I think it's really, really important. And I don't want someone to immediately lie.
Yeah, right.
My code of conduct at my current organization, which I'm in the process of updating, it's over 50 pages long, mostly text. Who's going to read a 50-page code of conduct?
I'm shocked you read it. Just kidding.
Yeah. Well, I have. You know how hard it is to update it? I'm
sure, yeah.
It's so hard. But I can't ask people to say they read it when I know for a fact that 99% of the time they probably have not.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to know that going into it and use language that doesn't immediately set people up for failure.
Great.
And where can we get a level of comfort that they've done something and that they can be truthful in their certification?
Right.
And I usually settle at that they know where to find it, that they've received it, that they will review it when needed, and that they'll report concerns they have.
There you go.
But I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and it's way better than making them lie to the ethics and compliance officer or to the ethics and compliance office on their first interaction. So this was so fun. We are right at time, so I will let you go. You are the coolest. This was really a great conversation. Thanks for being so generous with your experience and your ideas. This is awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Take it easy.